Explaining the Gap.
Wherever we look, there is one thing about the Islamic world that is very striking. According to the records of the courts of Istanbul and Galati, in the 17th century, almost 80% of all companies in both regions had only two partners. And of course, there was no large company with hundreds of shareholders, such as the British East India Company. Islamic companies from the modern age onwards were always characterized by being very small, by having problems to develop. A clear example is that while in Europe, the first large banks emerged in the 17th century, with the Bank of Amsterdam. In the Middle East, they did not arrive until the second half of the 19th century. We are therefore talking about a delay of more than 200 years. The question is, why did the Islamic world lag so far behind? Why did its companies suffer from this kind of chronic dwarfism? If you are loyal followers of visual economic, you surely already know what we are talking about. The lack of large companies is usually a sign of lack of innovation and development. And how do we explain all this? Well, although there are many causes, there are at least three reasons that are absolutely key to this whole issue. In Muslim countries, inheritance is very well regulated by the Quran and is very egalitarian. This means one cannot discriminate against the rest of the children by leaving all the inheritance to the firstborn. And yes, I know this sounds anything but backward. It's basically what exists today throughout the West. But while in the Middle East it was an age-old tradition, in Europe it didn't emerge until the Industrial Revolution. Even so, just because it seems advanced today does not mean that it was useful or positive at any stage of development. At that time, Muslim societies were polygamous, meaning that the elites had several wives, and therefore many children. So inheritance was completely diluted. And why is that a problem? Well, you see, according to the business regulations existing at that time, when a person died, his company had to be dissolved with him. So if the sons wanted to keep their father's business, they had to rebuild the company from scratch. The problem was that since the inheritances were diluted among so many heirs, it was very difficult for a son to raise all the capital necessary to rebuild the company and get it going again. Knowing this, many entrepreneurs also made little effort to make their business projects last in the long term, as they knew that if they died, they would most likely disappear. So in other words, there was very little incentive to create large companies. However, there are even more reasons why large companies did not emerge. Take a look. Do you remember that we started the previous section talking about how the Muslim world took a long time to have big banks? Well, this is also very important for companies. After all, without banks, who provides loans to start up a business? It is certainly much more difficult, and it turns out, interest-bearing loans were forbidden in Islam. However, unlike in other regions, such as the Christian West, this prohibition took a very long time to be lifted. And let's see, obviously there were always exceptions. In fact, the religious leaders themselves publicly promoted ways of granting loans according to Islamic law. For example, you could grant credit by buying a bedsheet from the borrower for 100 coins, with the premise that he would buy it back from you for 150 coins later. Loopholes like these were plentiful. Even so, gimmicks were only gimmicks, and so the banking industry had a very difficult time growing. All this meant that while French companies could finance themselves at an average rate of around 5%, those of the Ottoman Empire had to finance themselves at more than 20%. This severe penalty on interest brought about a general backwardness in banking, and along with it, one of the most revolutionary inventions of the entire Middle Ages: bills of exchange. With these letters, Italian merchants, for instance, could travel without carrying cash, and these checks could operate with different currencies between several countries. And it is impossible to separate all this financial technology from the progress that was made in the banking sector, with great names such as the Medici, which I'm sure will ring a bell with all of you. Well, in the Middle East, many merchants still sailed with bags full of gold on their ships, a real attraction for pirates and bandits. And although there was something similar to bills of exchange that were much older, in fact, than the European ones, they were very rare and much less flexible. If it was already complicated to set up a company before, this was the nail in the coffin. But even so, there is one more reason that is fundamental to understanding why companies in this entire region have barely prospered. Let me ask you a question. Why are there no great historical examples of collaborations between Islamic and Western companies? The answer is actually very simple. Because no Muslim could form companies without following the precepts of Islamic law. So, if a European merchant wanted to have an Ottoman as a partner, he had to accept the rules of the Quran. Rules such as, if one of the two dies, the company is automatically dissolved. This explains why, within Muslim countries, it was precisely the religious minorities, which were not subject to Islamic law, that prospered the most. In these graphs, you can see how non-Muslims, despite being 55% of the population, accounted for almost 90% of all exports and imports from Beirut, a pattern that was repeated throughout the region. But there is another reason related to justice that also put many Westerners off investing, and that is that Ottoman judges were anything but reliable. To begin with, the judges of the empire, who were directly religious authorities, barely gave validity to written testimonies, such as, for instance, a contract. Yeah, that's what I said. Of all the trials in which a contract was presented as evidence in Istanbul during the 18th century, only 3% were sufficient proof. The rest required the oral testimonies of many more people. In contrast to all this, in the Christian world, contracts began to be an absolute necessary proof in commercial trials from before 1400. And of course, if most evidence in Islam was oral and written evidence was not given importance, who do you think they listened to when two testimonies clashed? Basically, the judges followed two rules. If the trial was a Muslim against a non-Muslim, the Muslim won the trial. But on the other hand, if the trial was between two people of the same religion, the winner was always the richest. Corruption was the order of the day. Be that as it may, the explanation we have just given you is somewhat incomplete. Many of these problems were also present in Christian countries, such as the prohibition of interest-bearing credit. In this sense, what we see in the Islamic world is not so much that it was a decadent society, but that it simply did not prosper. They weren't getting poorer, they just weren't getting richer. And we are not only talking about wealth. The types of labor contracts and the ways of forming a company with some partners remained almost unchanged for more than 1,000 years. In the meantime, Europeans were inventing more and more innovative business structures. The sin of usury eventually disappeared, and all these limitations were diluted. Therefore, the real question to be answered is, why didn't the Muslims follow suit? Why didn't these countries develop new types of businesses, or copy successful Western businesses? Well, let's take a look.
God helps those who help themselves.
I want you to look very carefully at the following chart. Before the 12th century, the main jobs in the Islamic world were related to commerce and industry. However, from the 12th century onwards, the number of jobs in bureaucratic and military affairs skyrocketed. The bureaucracy grew like wildfire. The merchants lost much of their importance to the military, and the religious sector became much more powerful. The ulema, which literally translates as those who have knowledge, were basically the religious elite of the time, authentic experts in Islamic law and theology. At first, these religious elites made their living from trade or patronage, but little by little, they moved away from these types of commercial activities and became closer and closer to political leaders such as sultans, viziers, and caliphs. Why is that, you may ask? The answer lies in legitimacy. A ruler can gain legitimacy because he is recognized by his people, because he is the descendant of a well-known figure, or because he is the son of a king. However, approaching religious authorities, at least in the Middle East, was the most important of all. Religion was the way to empower political leaders. But why did religion gain so much political influence? The answer lies in crop failure. You see, despite the fact that the Quran forbids feudal-type political organizations, a series of bad harvests, epidemics, and wars caused many people to move for refuge from the cities to the countryside, where at least food was available, and so emerged the iktas, which would be something equivalent to the European fiefdoms. In this context, both the political and religious authorities had a very hard time. On the one hand, the sultans were losing a lot of power to the nobles of the feudal iktas, and on the other hand, the religious scholars had lost much of their income due to less mercantile activity in the cities. With this in mind, the marriage between the sultans and the ulema seemed the optimal solution. Optimal for them, of course. For the rest of the citizens, it weighed down the economic growth of the region for almost 800 years.
In most cases, as a society evolves from primitive tribalism into an ordered civilization, a common religion permeates all its activities and helps to shape all its characteristic institutions. The rise of medieval Islam provides a typical example. Under such circumstances, the creation of political institutions entirely separate from the organization of the accepted religion seems hardly conceivable. On the other hand, Christianity broke into an ancient civilization that already had its own established hierarchy of government and its own sophisticated tradition of political thought based on non-Christian concepts.
Perhaps where the political-religious alliance is best seen is in an event that left many historians completely confused: the prohibition of the printing press. As you all know, Gutenberg's printing press was one of the most revolutionary inventions of mankind. In barely 50 years after its creation, more books were written than in the entire history of mankind, which spelt a tremendous economic boom. The Ottoman Empire, on the other hand, initially banned it for more than 200 years. And with all that we have told you, I'm sure you can understand why the printing press was a threat to the religious authorities. Just look at what happened in Europe with the Protestant Reformation.
The printing press did serious damage to the roots of the religious scholars' authority. It was no longer necessary for them to be present when the book was read to compensate for the abundance of the author in the text. Their monopoly on the transmission of knowledge was broken. The books could now be consulted by any Ahmad, Mahmud, or Muhammad who could interpret them as they wished. The
literacy rate of Turkey and its corresponding counterpart in the Ottoman Empire reached that of 15th century Netherlands in the 1960s. So, in 1960, Turkey had the level of the Netherlands back in the 1400s. Crazy. In short, political authority depended enormously on religious authority, much more so than the kings of European kingdoms, even more so than figures such as the Catholic monarchs, even though they bore the word Catholic in their names. In exchange for religious support, politicians were willing to make all kinds of concessions, often in the form of laws that explicitly prevented economic development. This explains why the inheritance laws mentioned before lasted for so many centuries, despite being so damaging. Of course, while this relationship between religious and political elites still exists in many Eastern countries, in others it has been lost and does not seem to have flourished much. Even so, although it is not completely determining, we do know that in economic development, history matters, and matters a great deal, and that the institutions of the past have a great influence on the institutions of the present. The culture and the type of incentives that existed in those societies meant that when some of these countries embraced secularism, they did so in a very different way from the West, through movements such as Arab socialism, and we all know how that ended up. But at this point, it's now your turn. Was there a decline in the Middle East, or just stagnation while its neighbors kept growing? What other reasons could explain this huge gap today? Will we soon see an economic and democratic boom in any of these countries without the need for oil or tax havens? You can leave me your answers in the comments. And as